Samadhi is an ancient Sanskrit word for which there's no modern equivalent. There's a fundamental challenge with making a film about Samadhi. Samadhi points to something that can't be conveyed on the level of mind. This film is simply the outer manifestation of my own inner journey. The intention is not to teach you about Samadhi or provide information for your mind, but to inspire you to directly discover your true nature. Samadhi is relevant now more than ever. We are at a time in history where we have not only forgotten Samadhi, but we've forgotten what we forgot. This forgetting is Maya, the illusion of the self. As humans, most of us live immersed in our daily lives, with little thought of who we are, why we are here, or where we're going. Most of us have never realized the true self, the soul, or what the Buddha called anatta, that which is beyond name and form, beyond thinking. As a result, we believe we are these limited bodies. We live in fear, either conscious or unconscious, that the limited self-structure that we are identified with will die. In today's world, the vast majority of people who are engaged in religious or spiritual practices, such as yoga, prayer, meditation, chanting, or any kind of ritual, are practicing techniques which are conditioned, which means they are just part of the ego construct. The seeking and the activity isn't the problem. Thinking you have found the answer in some external form is the problem. Spirituality, in its most common form, is no different than the pathological thinking that is going on everywhere. It is a further agitation of the mind, more human doing as opposed to human being. The ego construct wants more money, more power, more love, more of everything. Those on the so-called spiritual path desire to be more spiritual, more awake, more equanimous, more peaceful, more enlightened. The danger for you watching this film is that your mind will want to acquire Samadhi. Even more dangerous is that your mind might think it has acquired Samadhi. Whenever there's a desire to attain something, you can be sure it's the ego construct at work. Samadhi is not about attaining or adding something more to yourself. To realize Samadhi is to learn to die before you die. Life and death are like yin and yang, an inseparable continuum, endlessly unfolding with no beginning and no end. When we push away death, we also push away life. When you experience the truth directly of who you are, there's no longer any fear of life or death. We're told who we are by our society and our culture. And at the same time, we're slaves to the deeper unconscious biological craving and aversion that governs our choices. The ego construct is nothing more than the impulse to repeat. It's simply the path that energy once took, and the tendency for the energy to take that path again, whether it is positive or negative for the organism. There are endless levels of memory or mind, spirals within spirals. When your consciousness identifies with this mind or ego construct, it ties you to social conditioning, which you could call the matrix. There are aspects of the ego that we can be conscious of, but it's the unconscious, the archaic wiring, the primal existential fears that are actually driving the whole machine. Endless patterns of grasping towards pleasure and avoidance of pain are sublimated into pathological behaviors. Our work, our relationships, our beliefs, our very thoughts, and our whole way of living. Like cattle, most humans live and die in passive subjugation, feeding their lives to the matrix. We live lives locked into narrow patterns, lives often filled with great suffering, and it never occurs to us that we can actually become free. It is possible to let go of the life that has been inherited from the past, to live the one that is waiting to come forth through the inner world. We were all born into this world with biological conditioned structures, but without self-awareness. Often, when you look into a young child's eyes, there's no trace of self, only luminous emptiness. The person one grows into is a mask worn over consciousness. Shakespeare said, "All the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players." In an awakened individual, consciousness shines through the personality, through the mask. When you are awake, you don't become identified with your character. You don't believe that you are the masks that you are wearing. But nor do you give up playing a role. When we are identified with our character, our persona, this is Maya, the illusion of the self. Samadhi is awakening from the dream of your character in the play of life. "2,400 years after Plato wrote the Republic, humanity is still making its way out of Plato's cave. In fact, we may be more transfixed by illusions than ever. Plato had Socrates describe a group of people who lived chained in a cave all their lives, facing a blank wall. All they could see were shadows projected on the wall by the things passing in front of a fire which was behind them. This puppet show became their world. According to Socrates, the shadows were as close as the prisoners would ever get to seeing reality. Even after being told about the outside world, they continued to believe that the shadows were all that is. Even if they suspected there was something more, they were unwilling to leave what was familiar. Humanity today is like the people who have only seen the shadows on the cave wall. The shadows are analogous to our thoughts. The world of thinking is the only world that we know, but there is another world that's beyond thinking, beyond the dualistic mind. Are you willing to leave the cave? To leave all that you have known, to find out the truth of who you are? In order to experience Samadhi, it's necessary to turn attention away from the shadows, away from the thoughts, towards the light. When a person is only used to darkness, then they must gradually become accustomed to the light. Like acclimatizing to any new paradigm, it takes time and effort, and a willingness to explore the new, as well as shed the old. The mind can be likened to a trap for consciousness, a labyrinth or a prison. It is not that you are in prison, you are the prison. The prison is an illusion. If you are identified with an illusory self, then you are asleep. Once you are aware of the prison, if you fight to get out of the illusion, then you're treating the illusion as if it's real, and you still remain asleep. Except now the dream becomes a nightmare. You'll be chasing and running from shadows forever. Samadhi is awakening from the dream of the separate self, or the egoic construct. Samadhi is awakening from identification with the prison that I call me. You can never actually be free because wherever you go, your prison is there. Awakening is not about getting rid of the mind or the matrix. On the contrary, when you're not identified with it, then you can experience the play of life more fully, enjoying the show as it is, without craving or fear. In the ancient teachings, this was called the divine game of Leela, the game of playing in duality. Human consciousness is a continuum. On one extreme, humans are identified with the material self. On the other extreme is Samadhi, the cessation of self. Every step we take on the continuum towards Samadhi brings less suffering. Less suffering does not mean life is free from pain. Samadhi is beyond the duality of pain and pleasure. What it means is that there is less mind, less self creating resistance to whatever unfolds. And that resistance is what creates suffering. Realizing Samadhi even once allows you to see what is at the other end of the continuum, to see that there is something other than the material world and self-interest. When there is an actual cessation of the self-structure in Samadhi, there is no egoic thought, no self, no duality, yet there is still the I am, anatta, or no self. In that emptiness is the dawn of prajna, or wisdom. The understanding that the immanent self is far beyond the play of duality, beyond the entire continuum. The immanent self is timeless, unchanging, always now. Enlightenment is the merging of the primordial spiral, the ever-changing manifested world or lotus in which time unfolds, with your timeless being. Your inner wiring grows like an ever-unfolding flower as you disidentify with the self, becoming a living bridge between the world of time and the timeless. Merely realizing the immanent self is only the beginning of one's path. Most people will have to experience and lose Samadhi countless times in meditation before they are able to integrate it into other facets of life. It's not unusual to have profound insights into the nature of your being during meditation or self-inquiry, only to find yourself once again falling back into old patterns, forgetting the truth of who you are. To realize that stillness or emptiness in every facet of life, every facet of one's self, is to become emptiness, dancing as all things. Stillness is not something separate from movement. It is not opposite to movement. In Samadhi, stillness is recognized to be identical with movement. Form is identical to emptiness. this is nonsensical to the mind, because mind is the coming into being of duality. René Descartes, the father of Western philosophy, is famous for the saying, "I think, therefore I am." No other phrase more clearly encapsulates the fall of civilization and the full-scale identification with the shadows on the cave wall. Descartes' error, like the error of almost all humans, was the equating of fundamental being with thinking. At the beginning of his most famous treatise, Descartes wrote that almost everything can be called into doubt. He can doubt his senses and even his thoughts. Likewise, in the Kalama Sutra, the Buddha said that in order to ascertain the truth, one must doubt all traditions, scriptures, teachings, and all the content of one's mind and senses. Both of these men started with great skepticism, but the difference was that Descartes stopped inquiring at the level of thinking, while the Buddha went deeper. He penetrated beyond the deepest levels of the mind. Maybe, if Descartes had gone beyond his thinking mind, he would have realized his true nature, and Western consciousness would be very different today. Instead, Descartes described the possibility of an evil demon that could be keeping us under a veil of illusion. Descartes did not recognize this evil demon for what it was. As in the movie The Matrix, we could all be hooked up to some elaborate program, feeding us an illusory dream world. In the movie, humans lived out their lives in the Matrix, while on another level they were merely batteries, feeding their life force to the machines, which used their energy for their own agenda. Always want to blame something outside themselves for the state of the world or for their own unhappiness, whether it's a person, a particular group or country, religion, or some kind of controlling Illuminati, like Descartes' evil demon or the sentient machines in the Matrix. Ironically, the demon Descartes envisioned was the very thing that he defined himself by. When you realize Samadhi, it becomes clear that there is a controller. There is a machine, an evil demon leeching your life day after day. The machine is you. Your self-structure is made up of many little conditioned subprograms, or little bosses. One little boss that craves food, another craves money, another status, position, power, sex, intimacy. Another wants consciousness or attention from others. The desires are literally endless and can never be satisfied. We spend a lot of our time and energy decorating our prisons, succumbing to pressures to improve our masks and feeding these little bosses, making them more powerful. Like drug addicts, the more we try to satisfy the little bosses, the more we end up craving. The path to freedom is not self-improvement, or somehow satisfying the self's agenda, but it's a dropping of the self's agenda altogether. Some people fear that awakening their true nature will mean that they lose their individuality and enjoyment of life. Actually, the opposite is true. The unique individuation of the soul can only be expressed when the conditioned self is overcome. Because we remain asleep in the matrix, most of us never find out what the soul actually wants to express. The path to Samadhi involves meditation, which is both observing the conditioned self, that which changes, and realizing your true nature, that which does not change. When you come to your still point, the source of your being, then you await further instructions without any insistence on how your outer world has to change. Not my will, but higher will be done. If the mind only tries to change the outer world to conform with some idea of what you think the path should be, it's like trying to change the image in a mirror by manipulating the reflection. To make the image in a mirror smile, you obviously can't manipulate the reflection. You have to realize the you that is the authentic source of the reflection. Once you realize the authentic self, it doesn't mean that anything on the outside necessarily needs to change. What changes is the conscious, intelligent inner energy, or prana, which is freed from conditioned patterns and becomes available to be directed by the soul. You can only become aware of the soul's purpose when you are able to watch the conditioned self and its endless pursuits, and let them go. In Greek mythology, it was said that the gods condemned Sisyphus to repeat a meaningless task for all eternity. His task was to endlessly push a boulder up a mountain, only to have it roll down again. The French existentialist and Nobel Prize-winning author, Albert Camus, saw the situation of Sisyphus as a metaphor for humanity. He asked the question, how can we find meaning in this absurd existence? As humans, we are toiling endlessly, building for a tomorrow that never arrives. And then we die. If we truly realize this truth, then we will either go mad if we are identified with our egoic personas, or we will awaken and become free. We can never succeed in the outer struggle because it's just a reflection of our inner world. The cosmic joke, the absurdity of the situation becomes clear when there's a complete and utter failure of the egoic self to awaken through its futile pursuits. In Zen, there is a saying, before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. Before enlightenment, one must roll the ball up the hill. After enlightenment, one must also roll the ball up the hill. What has changed? The inner resistance to what is. The struggle has been dropped, or rather, the one who struggles has been realized to be illusory. The individual will, or individual mind, and divine will, or higher mind, are aligned. Samadhi is ultimately a dropping of all inner resistance to all changing phenomena without exception. The one who is able to realize inner peace, irrespective of circumstance, has attained true Samadhi. You drop resistance not because you condone one thing or another, but so that your inner freedom is not contingent on the outer. It's important to note that when we accept reality as it is, it doesn't necessarily mean that we stop taking action in the world, or we become meditating pacifists. Actually, the opposite can be true. When we're free to act without being driven by unconscious motives, then it is possible to act in alignment with the Tao, with the full force of our inner energy behind us. Many will argue that in order to change the world and bring about peace, we need to fight harder against our perceived enemies. Fighting for peace is like shouting for silence. It just creates more of what you don't want. These days there's a war against everything. A war against terror, a war against disease, a war against hunger. Every war is actually a war against ourselves. The fight is part of a collective delusion. We say that we want peace, but we continue to elect leaders who engage in war. We lie to ourselves, saying that we are for human rights, but continue to buy products made in sweatshops. We say we want clean air, but we continue to pollute. We want science to cure us of cancer, but won't change our self-destructive habitual behaviors that make us more likely to be sick. We delude ourselves that we are promoting a better life. We don't want to see our hidden parts that are condoning suffering and death. The belief that we can win a war against cancer, hunger, terror, or any enemy that was created by our own thinking and behavior actually lets us continue to delude ourselves that we don't have to change the way we operate on this planet. The inner world is where the revolution must first take place. Only when we can directly feel the spiral of life within will the outer world come into alignment with the Tao. Until then, anything we do will add to the chaos already created by the mind. War and peace arise together in an endless dance. They are one continuum. One half cannot exist without the other. Just as light cannot exist without dark, and up cannot exist without down. The world seems to want light without darkness, fullness without emptiness, happiness without sadness. The more the mind gets involved, the more fragmented the world becomes. Every solution that comes from the egoic mind is driven by the idea that there is a problem, and the solution becomes an even greater problem than what it was trying to solve. What you resist persists. Human ingenuity creates new antibiotics, only to find nature getting more cunning as bacteria get stronger. Despite our best efforts in the ongoing fight, the prevalence of cancer is actually increasing. The number of hungry people in the world steadily grows. The number of terrorist attacks worldwide continues to rise. What's wrong with our approach? Like the sorcerer's apprentice from Goethe's poem, we have taken hold of a great power, but we do not have the wisdom to wield it. The problem is that we do not understand the tool that we are using. We do not understand the human mind and its proper role and purpose. The crisis is born of the limited, conditioned way in which we think, the way we feel and experience life. Our rationalism has robbed us of our ability to recognize and experience the wisdom of many ancient cultures. Our egoic thinking has robbed us of the ability to feel the depth and profound sacredness of life, the numinosity of life, and to realize entirely different levels of consciousness, which are now almost lost to humanity. In the ancient Egyptian tradition, netters were archetypal forms whose characteristics could be embodied by those who purified their physical and spiritual bodies in such a way that they were fit to house higher consciousnesses. The original netter, or the divine principle of this wisdom, was known as Thoth, or Tehuti, often depicted as a scribe with the head of a bird or ibis, and represented the origin of all knowledge and wisdom. Thoth could be described as the cosmic principle of thinking, or thought. Thoth gave us language, concepts, writing, mathematics, and all the arts and manifestations of the mind. Only those who had gone through special training were allowed to access Thoth's sacred knowledge. The Book of Thoth is not a physical book, but is the wisdom of the akashic or etheric realm. Legend tells that Thoth's knowledge was deeply hidden in a secret place within every human being, and was protected by a golden serpent. The archetypal or perennial myth of the serpent or dragon guarding a treasure is one that permeates many cultures and has been called by names such as Kundalini Shakti, Chi, Holy Spirit, and inner energy. The golden serpent is the egoic construct which is bound in the inner energies, and until it's mastered and overcome, the soul will never be able to attain the true wisdom. It was said that the Book of Thoth brought nothing but suffering to any individual who read it, even though they would find the secrets of the gods themselves and all that is hidden within the stars. What must be understood is that the book brought suffering to any individual who read it, any ego that tried to control it. In the Egyptian tradition, awakened consciousness was represented by Osiris. Without this awakened consciousness, any knowledge or understanding attained by the limited self would be dangerous, disconnected from higher wisdom. The Eye of Horus had to be open. The esoteric meaning that we find here is similar to the more familiar story of the fall in the Garden of Eden. The Book of Thoth parallels the tree of knowledge of good and evil, whose fruit Adam and Eve were tempted to eat. Humanity, of course, has already eaten the forbidden fruit, already opened the Book of Thoth, and has been cast out of the garden. The serpent is a metaphor for the primordial spiral that extends from the microcosm to the macrocosm. Today, the serpent is living as you. It is the egoic mind expressed as the manifested world. We have never before had access to so much knowledge. We've gone deep into the material world, even finding the so-called God particle. But we've never been more limited, more ignorant of who we are and how to live. And we do not understand the mechanism by which we create suffering. Our thinking has created the world as it is now. Whenever we label something as good or bad, or create a preference in our mind, it's due to the coming into being of egoic structures or self-interests. The solution is not to fight for peace or conquer nature, but to simply recognize the truth that the very existence of the ego structure creates duality, a split between self and other, mine and yours, man and nature, inner and outer. The ego is violence. It requires a barrier, a boundary from the other in order to be. Without the ego, there's no war against anything. There's no hubris. There's no overreaching nature to create profit. These external crises in our world reflect a serious inner crisis. We don't know who we are. We are completely identified with our egoic identities, consumed by fears, and are cut off from our true nature. Races, religions, countries, political affiliations, and any group that we belong to all reinforce our egoic identities. Almost every group that exists on the planet today wants to claim its perspective as true and correct, as we do on an individual level. By claiming the truth as its own, the group perpetuates its own existence, in the same way that an ego or self-structure defines itself against other. Now, more than ever, different realities and polarized belief systems are coexisting on Earth. It is possible for different people to experience completely different thoughts and emotional reactions to the very same external phenomena. In the same way, samsara and nirvana, or heaven and hell, are two different dimensions occupying the very same world. An event that may appear apocalyptic to one person could be seen as a blessing to another. So what is becoming obvious is that your external circumstances don't have to affect your inner world in any particular way. To realize Samadhi is to become a self-propelled wheel, to become autonomous, a universe unto oneself. Your experience of life is not contingent on changing phenomena. An analogy can be made with Metatron's cube. Metatron is mentioned in various ancient Christian, Islamic, and Jewish texts, and is archetypally related to the Egyptian Neter Thoth, as well as Hermes Trismegistus of Greece. Metatron is intimately connected with the Tetragrammaton. The Tetragrammaton is the fundamental geometric pattern, the template or primordial emanation of physical reality, which has been called the Word of God or the Logos. Here we see a two-dimensional representation of the figure, but if you look a certain way, you see a 3D cube. When you see the cube, nothing has changed in the figure, but your mind has added a new dimension to your seeing. Dimensionality, or one's perspective, is simply a matter of becoming habituated to a new way of perceiving the world. Upon realizing Samadhi, we become free of perspective, or free to create new perspectives, because there's no self invested in or attached to a particular viewpoint. The greatest minds in human history have often pointed to levels of thought beyond the limited self-structure. Einstein said, "The true measure of a human being is determined primarily by the measure and sense in which he has attained liberation from the self." So it's not that thinking in the existence of the self is bad. Thinking is a wonderful tool when the mind is in service to the heart. In Vedanta, it is said that the mind makes a good servant, but a poor master. The ego perpetually filters reality through language and labels, and is constantly judging, preferring one thing over another. When the mind and senses are your master, they will create endless suffering, endless craving and aversion, locking us into the matrix of thinking. If you want to realize Samadhi, do not judge your thoughts as good or bad, but find out who you are prior to thought, prior to the senses. When all labels are dropped, then it is possible to see things as they are. The moment a child is told what a bird is, if they believe what they're told, then they never see a bird again. They only see their thoughts. Most people think that they are free, conscious, and awake. But if you believe you are already awake, then why would you do the difficult work to attain what you believe you already have? Before it becomes possible to awaken, it is necessary to accept that you are asleep, living in the matrix. Examine your life honestly without lying to yourself. Are you able to stop your robotic, repetitive life patterns if you want to? Can you stop seeking pleasure and avoiding pain? Are you addicted to certain foods, activities, or pastimes? Are you constantly judging, blaming, criticizing yourself and others? Does your mind incessantly seek out stimulus, or are you completely fulfilled just being in silence? Do you react to how people think about you? Are you seeking approval and positive reinforcement? Do you somehow sabotage situations in your life? Most people will experience their lives the same way today as they will tomorrow, and a year from now, and 10 years from now. When you begin to observe your robot-like nature, you become more awake. You begin to recognize the depth of the problem. You are completely and utterly asleep, lost in a dream. Like the inhabitants of Plato's cave, most who hear this truth will not be willing or capable of changing their lives because they are attached to their familiar patterns. We go to great lengths justifying our patterns, burying our heads in the sand rather than facing the truth. We want our saviors, but we are not willing to get up on the cross ourselves. What are you willing to pay to be free? Realize that if you change your inner world, you must be prepared to change the outer life. Your old structure and your old identity must become the dead soil out of which new growth comes. The first step to awakening is to realize that we are identified with the matrix of the human mind, or the mask. Something within us must hear this truth and be roused from its slumber. There's a part of you, something timeless, that has always known the truth. The matrix of the mind distracts us, entertains us, keeps us endlessly doing, consuming, grasping, in a cycle of craving and aversion with constantly changing forms, keeping us from the flowering of our consciousness, our evolutionary birthright, which is Samadhi. Pathological thinking is what passes for normal life. Your divine essence has become enslaved, identified with a limited self-structure. The great wisdom, the truth of who you are, is buried deep within your being. J. Krishnamurti said, "It is no measure of one's health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society." Identification with the egoic mind is the sickness, and Samadhi is the cure. The world's greatest spiritual teachers from ancient to modern times have shared the view that the deepest truth of our being is not the property of one particular religion or spiritual tradition, but can be found within the heart of each person. Poet Rumi said, "Where is that moon that never rises or sets? Where is that soul that is neither with nor without us? Don't say it is here or there. All creation is that, but for the eyes that can see." In the story of the Tower of Babel, humanity fragmented into countless languages, beliefs, cultures, and interests. Babel means literally the gate of God. The gate is our thinking mind, our conditioned structures. For those who come to realize their true nature, their essence beyond name and form, they are initiated into the great mystery of what lies beyond the gate. An ancient parable, the elephant parable, has been used to describe how various traditions are actually all pointing to one great truth. A group of blind people are each touching a different part of an elephant, getting a certain impression of what an elephant is. The person standing at the elephant's leg describes the elephant as being like a tree. The person at the tail says the elephant is like a rope. The elephant is like a spear, says the one standing at the tusk. If one touches the ear, it seems the elephant is like a fan. The person touching the side is adamant that the elephant is like a wall. The problem is, we touch our piece of the elephant, and we believe our experience is the only truth. We don't acknowledge or appreciate that each person's experience is a different facet of the same animal. Perennial philosophy is an understanding that all spiritual and religious traditions share a single universal truth, a mystical or transcendent reality upon which foundation all spiritual knowledge and doctrine has grown. Swami Vivekananda summed up the perennial teaching when he said, "The end of all religions is the realizing of God in the soul. That is the one universal religion." In this film, when we use the word God, it is simply a metaphor for the transcendent, pointing to the great mystery beyond the limited egoic mind. To realize one's true self or immanent self is to realize one's divine nature. Every soul has the potential to manifest a new higher level of consciousness, to awaken from its slumber and its identification with form. The writer and visionary Aldous Huxley, known for his book Brave New World, also wrote a book which he entitled The Perennial Philosophy, in which he writes about the one teaching that comes back over and over in history, taking the form of the culture in which it is realized. He writes, "The perennial philosophy is expressed most succinctly in the Sanskrit formula, Tat Tvam Asi, that thou art. The Atman, or immanent eternal self, is one with Brahman, the absolute principle of all existence. And the last end of every human being is to discover the fact for himself, to find out who he or she really is." Each tradition is like a facet of a jewel, reflecting a unique perspective of the same truth, while at the same time echoing and illuminating each other. Whatever the language and conceptual framework used, all religions that reflect the perennial teaching have some notion that there is a union with something greater, something beyond us. It is possible to learn from and integrate the teachings from one or many sources without identifying a sense of self with them. It is said that all true spiritual teachings are simply fingers pointing to the transcendent truth. If we hold on to the dogma, the teaching, for comfort, we will be stunted in our spiritual evolution. To realize truth beyond any concept is letting go of all clinging and attachment. Letting go of all religious concepts. From the ego's perspective, the finger pointing you to Samadhi is pointing straight toward the abyss. St. John of the Cross said, "If one wishes to be sure of the road they tread, one must close their eyes and walk in the dark." Samadhi begins with a leap into the unknown. In the ancient traditions, in order to realize Samadhi, it was said that one must ultimately turn consciousness away from all known objects, from all external phenomena, conditioned thoughts and sensations, toward consciousness itself, toward the inner source, the heart or essence of one's being. In this film, when we use the word Samadhi, we are pointing to the transcendent, to the highest Samadhi, which has been named Nirvikalpa Samadhi. In Nirvikalpa Samadhi, there is a cessation of self-activity, of all seeking and doing. We can only speak about what falls away as we approach it, and what reappears when we return from it. There is neither perception nor non-perception, neither thing nor no thing, neither consciousness nor unconsciousness. It is absolute, unfathomable, and inscrutable to the mind. When the self returns to activity, there's a not knowing, a kind of rebirth, and everything becomes new again. We are left with the perfume of the divine, which lingers longer as one evolves on the path. There are numerous types of samadhi described in the ancient traditions, and language has created much confusion over the years. We are choosing to use the word samadhi to point to the transcendent union, but we could have used a word from another tradition just as easily. Samadhi is an ancient Sanskrit term, common to the Vedic, Yogic, and Samkhya traditions of India, and has permeated many other spiritual traditions. Samadhi is the 8th limb of Patanjali's 8 limbs of yoga, and the 8th part of the Buddha's Noble Eightfold Path. The Buddha used the word nirvana, the cessation of vana, or the cessation of self-activity. Patanjali described yoga or samadhi as chitta vritti nirodha, the Sanskrit meaning cessation of the whirlpool or spiral of mind. It is a disentangling of consciousness from the entire matrix or creatrix of mind. Samadhi does not signify any concept, because to realize it requires a dropping of the conceptual mind. Different religions have used various words to describe the divine union. In fact, the word religion itself means something similar. In Latin, religare means to rebind or reconnect. It's a similar meaning to the word yoga, which means to yoke, to unite the worldly with the transcendent. In Islam, it is reflected in the ancient Arabic meaning of the word Islam itself, which means submission or supplication to God. It signifies a total humbling or surrender of the self-structure. Christian mystics, such as Saint Francis of Assisi, Saint Teresa of Avila, and Saint John of the Cross, describe a divine union with God, the kingdom of God within. In the Gospel of Thomas, Christ said, "The kingdom is not here or there. Rather, the kingdom of the Father is spread out upon the earth, and men do not see it." The works of the Greek philosophers Plato, Plotinus, Parmenides, and Heraclitus, when seen through the lens of the perennial teaching, point towards the same wisdom. Plotinus teaches that the greatest human endeavor is to guide the human soul towards the supreme state of perfection and union with the One. The Lakota medicine and holy man, Black Elk, said, "The first peace, which is the most important, is that which comes within the souls of men when they realize their relationship, their oneness with the universe and all its powers, and when they realize that at the center of the universe dwells Great Spirit, and that this center is really everywhere. It is within each of us." On the path to awakening, unless we are in Samadhi, there are always two polarities, two doorways one can enter. Two dimensions, one towards pure consciousness, the other towards the phenomenal world. The upward current toward the Absolute, and the downward current toward Maya and all that is manifested, both seen and unseen. The relationship between relative and absolute could be summed up in the following quote by Sri Nisargadatta Maharaj. "Wisdom is knowing I am nothing. Love is knowing I am everything. And between the two, my life moves." What is born of this union is a new divine consciousness. Something is born out of the marriage or union of these polarities, or the collapse of dualistic identification. Yet what is born is not a thing, and it was never born. Consciousness flowers, creating something new, creating what you could call a perennial trinity. God the Father, the transcendent, unknowable and changeless, is united with the divine feminine, which is everything that changes. This union brings about an alchemical transformation, a kind of death and rebirth. In the Vedic teachings, the divine union is represented by two fundamental forces, Shiva and Shakti. The names and faces of the various gods change throughout history, but their fundamental attributes remain. What is born out of this union is a new divine consciousness, a new way of being in the world. Two polarities inseparably one, a universal energy that is without center, free of limitation. It is pure love. There is nothing to be gained or lost, because it is utterly empty, but absolutely full. Whether it is the mystery schools of Mesopotamia, the spiritual traditions of the Babylonians and Assyrians, religions of ancient Egypt, Nubian and Kemetic cultures of ancient Africa, the shamanic and native traditions around the world, the mysticism of ancient Greece, the Gnostics, the non-dualists, the Buddhists, the Taoists, Jews, Zoroastrians, Jains, Muslims, or Christians, one finds that their common link is their highest spiritual insights have allowed their adherents to realize Samadhi. The actual word Samadhi means something like to realize the sameness or oneness in all things. It means union. It is uniting all aspects of yourself. But do not mistake intellectual understanding for the actual realization of Samadhi. It is your stillness, your emptiness, that unites all levels of the spiral of life. It is through the ancient teaching of Samadhi that humanity can begin to understand the common source of all religions and come into alignment once again with the spiral of life, Great Spirit, Dhamma, or the Tao. The spiral is the bridge that extends from the microcosm to the macrocosm. From your DNA to the inner lotus of energy that extends through the chakras, to the spiral arms of galaxies. Every level of soul is expressed through the spiral as ever-evolving branches, living, exploring. True Samadhi is realizing the emptiness of all levels of self, all sheaths of the soul. The spiral is the endless play of duality and the cycle of life and death. At times, we forget our connection to the source. The lens we look through is very small, and we identify with being a limited creature creeping upon the earth, only to once again complete the journey back to the source, to the center that is everywhere. Chuan Tzu said, "When there is no more separation between this and that, it is called the still point of the Tao." At the still point, in the center of the spiral, one can see the infinite in all things. The ancient mantra Om Mani Padme Hum has a poetic meaning. One awakens or realizes the jewel within the lotus. Your true nature awakens within the soul, within the world, as the world. Using the Hermetic principle, as above, so below, as below, so above, we can use analogies to begin to understand the relationship between mind and stillness, relative and absolute. A way to begin to grasp the non-conceptual nature of Samadhi is to use the analogy of the black hole. A black hole is traditionally described as a region of space with a massive gravitational field so powerful that no light or matter can escape. New theories postulate that all objects, from the tiniest microscopic particles to macrocosmic formations like galaxies, have a black hole or mysterious singularity at their center. In this analogy, we're going to use this new definition of a black hole as the center that is everywhere. In Zen, there are many poems and koans that bring us face to face with the gateless gate. One must pass the gateless gate to realize Samadhi. An event horizon is a boundary in space-time beyond which events cannot affect an outside observer, which means that whatever is happening beyond the event horizon is unknowable to you. You could say that the event horizon of a black hole is analogous to the gateless gate. It is the threshold between the self and no self. There is no me that passes the event horizon. In the center of a black hole is the one-dimensional singularity containing the mass of billions of suns in an unimaginably small space, effectively an infinite mass, literally a universe in something infinitesimally smaller than a grain of sand. The singularity is something unfathomable, beyond time and space. According to physics, movement is impossible. The existence of things is impossible. Whatever it is, it does not belong to the world of perception. Yet it cannot be described as merely stillness. It is beyond stillness and movement. When you realize the center that is everywhere and nowhere, duality breaks down. Form and emptiness, time and the timeless. One could call it a dynamic stillness or a pregnant emptiness within the center of absolute darkness. The Taoist teacher Lao Tzu said, "Darkness within darkness, the gateway to all understanding." The writer and comparative mythologist Joseph Campbell describes a recurring symbol, part of the perennial philosophy which he calls the axis mundi, the central point or the highest mountain, the pole around which all revolves, the point where stillness and movement are together. From this center, a mighty flowering tree is realized, a Bodhi tree that joins all worlds. Just as a sun gets sucked into a black hole, when you approach the great reality, your life starts to revolve around it, and you begin to disappear. As you approach the immanent self, it can be terrifying to the ego structure. The guardians of the gate are there to test those on their journey. One must be willing to face one's greatest fears, and at the same time accept one's inherent power, to bring light to the unconscious terrors and the hidden beauty within. If your mind is not moved, if there is no self reacting, then all phenomena produced by the unconscious arises and passes away. This is the point in the spiritual journey where faith is most needed. What do we mean by faith? Faith is not the same as belief. Belief is accepting something on the level of mind to bring comfort and assurance. Belief is the mind's way of labeling or controlling experience. Faith is actually the opposite. Faith is staying in the place of complete not knowing, accepting whatever arises from the unconscious. Faith is surrendering to the pull of the singularity, to the dissolving or dismantling of the self in order to pass the gateless gate. The evolution and structure of a galaxy is closely tied to the scale of its black hole, just as your evolution is tied to the presence of the immanent self, the singularity that is your true nature. We can't see the black hole, but we can know about it by the way things move around it, by how it interacts with physical reality. In the same way, we cannot see our true nature. The immanent self is not a thing, but we can observe enlightened action. As the Zen master Suzuki said, there are, strictly speaking, no enlightened people. There is only enlightened activity. We can't see it, just as the eye cannot see itself. We can't see it because it is that by which seeing is possible. Like the black hole, Samadhi is not nothingness, and neither is it a thing. It is the collapse of the duality of thing and no thing. There is no gate to enter the great reality, but there are infinite paths. The paths, the dharmas, are like an endless spiral with no beginning and no end. No one can pass the gateless gate. No one's mind has ever figured out how, and none ever will. No one can pass the gateless gate, so be no one. Samadhi is the pathless path, the golden key. It is the end of our identification with the self-structures that separate our inner and outer worlds. There are many developmental models which describe the layers or levels of the self-structure. We will use an example which is very ancient. In the Upanishads, the sheaths which cover the Atman or soul are called koshas. Each kosha is like a mirror, a layer of the self-structure, a veil or level of Maya which distracts us from realizing our true nature if we are identified with it. Most people see the reflections and believe that that is who they are. One mirror reflects the animal layer, the physical body. Another mirror reflects your mind, your thoughts, your instincts and perceptions. Another your inner energy or prana, which you can observe when you turn inward. Another mirror reflects on the level of the imaginal, which is the higher mind or wisdom layer. And there are layers of transcendental or non-dual bliss that are experienced as one approaches Samadhi. There are potentially countless mirrors or aspects of self that one can differentiate, and they are constantly changing. Most people have yet to discover the pranic, higher mind, and non-dual bliss layers. They don't even know they exist. These layers are informing your life, but you do not see them. The hidden mirrors actually inform our lives more than the ones that are visible. They are unseen because for most people they are not fully illuminated by consciousness. Like Indra's net of jewels, the mirrors all reflect each other, and the reflections reflect every other reflection infinitely. A change on one level simultaneously affects all levels. Some of these mirrors may be left in the shadows, unless we are fortunate enough to have a competent guide to help us shine light upon them. The truth is, we don't know what we don't know. Now, imagine that you shatter all the mirrors. There's nothing reflecting you back to yourself. Where are you? When the mind becomes still, the mirrors cease to reflect. There is no more subject and object. But do not mistake the primordial state for nothingness or oblivion. The immanent self is not something, but neither is it nothing. This source is not a thing. It is emptiness or stillness itself. It is an emptiness that is the source of all things. Form is realized as exactly emptiness. Emptiness is realized as exactly form. This source is the great womb of creation, pregnant with all possibilities. Samadhi is the awakening of impersonal consciousness. Just as when you are having a dream, upon awakening you realize that everything in the dream was just in your mind. Upon realizing Samadhi, it is realized that everything in this world is happening within levels upon levels of energy and consciousness. It is all mirrors within mirrors, dreams within dreams. The you that you think you are is both the dream and the dreamer. Whatever we say in this film, let it go. Don't capture it with the mind. The soul is dreaming the dream of you. The dream is everything that is changing, but it is possible to realize the changeless. This realization cannot be understood with the limited individual mind. When we return from Nirvikalpa Samadhi, the mirrors begin to reflect again, and it is realized that the world you now think you are living in is actually you. Not the limited you, which is only a temporary reflection, but you are aware of your true nature as the source of all that is. This dawning of higher wisdom, the embryo, prajna, or gnosis, is what is born out of Samadhi. According to the book of Job, Chokmah, or wisdom, comes from nothingness. This point of wisdom is both infinitely small and yet encompasses the whole of being, but it remains incomprehensible until it is given shape and form in the palace of mirrors, called Bina, the womb carved out by higher wisdom, which gives shape to the embryonic spirit of God.
Bushmaya Ned Kadashmak Tiete Malkutak Dewe Tabeanak Aikanat Bushmaya of Bona.
The existence of the mirrors, or the mind's existence, is not a problem. On the contrary, the error or aberration of human perception is that we identify ourselves with it. This illusion that we are the limited self is Maya. The yogic teachings say that to realize Samadhi, one must observe the meditation object until it disappears. Until you disappear into it, or it into you. Although the language in the various traditions is dissimilar, at their root they all point towards a cessation of self-identification and self-centered activity. The Buddha always taught in negative terms. He taught to investigate directly into the working of the self-structure. He didn't say what Samadhi was, except that it was the end of suffering. In Advaita Vedanta, there's a term, neti-neti, which means not this, not that. People on the path to self-realization inquire into their true nature, or the nature of Brahman, by first discovering what they are not. Similarly, in Christianity, Saint Teresa of Avila described an approach to prayer based on the negative path, or via negativa, a prayer of quiet, surrender, and union, which is the only way to approach the Absolute. Through this gradual process of stripping away, one drops anything that is not permanent, anything that is changing. The mind, the ego construct, and all phenomena, including the hidden layers of self. The unconscious must become transparent in order to reflect the one source. If there is some deep knowing or some self operating in the unconscious, then our lives remain locked into a labyrinth of hidden patterns that comprise the undiscovered self. When all layers of self are revealed as empty, then one becomes free from the self, free from all concepts. A turning point in your evolution is when you realize you don't know who you are. Who experiences the breath? Who experiences the taste? Who experiences the chant, the ritual, the dance, the mountain? Witness the witness. Observe the observer. At first, when you observe the observer, you will only see the false self. But if you are persistent, it will give way. Inquire directly into who or what experiences. Unblinkingly, piercingly, penetratingly, with the full force of your being. There is no self that awakens. There is no you that awakens. What you are awakening from is the illusion of the separate self, from the dream of a limited you. To talk about it is meaningless. There must be an actual cessation of the self to realize directly what it is. And once it is realized, there is nothing that can be said about it. As soon as you say something, you are back in the mind. I have already said too much. We normally have 3 states of consciousness: waking, dreaming, and deep sleep. Samadhi is sometimes referred to as the 4th state, the ground state of consciousness, a primordial awakeness that can become present continuously and in parallel with the other consciousness states. In Vedanta, this is called Turiya. Other terms for Turiya are Christ consciousness, Krishna consciousness, Buddha nature, or Sahaja Samadhi. In Sahaja Samadhi, the immanent self stays present along with the full use of all human functions. The stillness is unmoving at the center of the spiral of changing phenomena. Thoughts, feelings, sensations, and energy revolve around it at the circumference, but the degree of stillness, or I amness, remains during outer activity, exactly as in meditation. It is possible that the immanent self will remain present, even during deep sleep, that your awareness of I am does not come and go, even as states of consciousness change. This is yogic sleep. In the Song of Songs, or the Song of Solomon from the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament, it reads, I sleep, but my heart waketh. This realization of the eternal, impersonal consciousness is reflected in the words of Christ when he said, Before Abraham was, I am. One consciousness that shines through countless faces, countless forms. At first, it's like a fragile flame born out of the polarities within you. Masculine, penetrating consciousness with a surrender or opening of feminine energy. It is delicate and easily lost, and one must take great care to protect it and keep it alive until it is mature. Samadhi is simultaneously a timeless state of consciousness and a stage in an unfolding development process, something organic and growing in time. As one spends more and more time in Samadhi, in the now, in the timeless, one takes more and more direction from the heart, the soul or Atman, and less from the conditioned structure. This is how one becomes free of the lower mind, free of pathological thinking. The inner wiring changes. Energy no longer flows unconsciously in the old conditioned structures, which is another way of saying one is no longer identified with the self-structure, with the outer world of form. To realize Samadhi requires an effort so great that it becomes a total surrender of oneself, and a surrender so encompassing that it is a complete effort of one's being, all of one's energy. It is a balance of effort and surrender, yin and yang, a sort of effortless effort. The Indian mystic and yogi Paramahamsa Ramakrishna said, "Do not seek illumination unless you seek it as one whose hair is on fire seeks a pond. You seek it with your whole being. During one's ego-transcending practice, it takes great courage, vigilance, and perseverance to keep the embryo alive. To not fall back into the patterns of the world. It takes a willingness to go against the current, against the inexorable crush of the matrix and the grinding wheels of samsara. Every breath, every thought, every action must be for realizing the source. Samadhi is not realized by effort, nor is it effortless. Let go of effort and non-effort. It's a duality that only exists in the mind. The actual realization of Samadhi is so simple, so undifferentiated, that it is always misconstrued through language, which is inherently dualistic. There is only one primordial consciousness that awakens as the world, but it has been obscured by many layers of mind. Like the sun hidden behind the clouds, as each layer of mind is dropped, one's essence is revealed. As each layer of mind is dropped, people call it a different samadhi. They give names to different experiences or different types of phenomena. But samadhi is so simple that when you are told what it is and how to realize it, your mind will always miss it. Actually, samadhi is not simple or difficult. It is only the mind that makes it so. When there is no mind, there is no problem, because the mind is what needs to stop before it is realized. It is not a happening at all. The most concise teaching of Samadhi is perhaps found in this phrase: be still and know. How can we use words and images to convey stillness? How can we convey silence by making noise? Rather than talking about samadhi as an intellectual concept, this film is a radical call to inaction, a call to meditation, inner silence, and inner prayer, a call to stop. Stop everything that is driven by the pathological, egoic mind. Be still and know. No one can tell you what will emerge from the stillness. It is a call to act from the spiritual heart. It's like remembering something ancient. The soul wakes up and remembers itself. It has been a sleeping passenger, but now the emptiness awakens and realizes itself as all things. You can't imagine what samadhi is with the limited egoic mind. Just as you can't describe to a blind person what color is. Your mind can't know. It can't manufacture it. To realize Samadhi is to see in a different way, not to see separate things, but to recognize the seer. Saint Francis of Assisi said, "What you are looking for is what is looking." Once you have seen the moon, you can recognize it in every reflection. The true self has always been there. It is in everything, but you have not realized its presence. When you learn to recognize and abide as the true self, beyond the mind and senses, it is possible to experience awe at the most mundane. We become awe. Do not try to be free of desires, because wanting to be free of desires is a desire. You can't try to be still, because your very effort is movement. Realize the stillness that is always already present. Be the stillness and know. When all preferences are dropped, the source will be revealed. But do not cling even to the source. The great reality, Tao, is not one, not two. Ramana Maharshi said, "The self is only one. If it is limited, it is the ego. If unlimited, it is infinite and the great reality." If you believe what is being said, you've missed it. If you disbelieve, you've also missed it. Belief and disbelief operate on the level of mind. They require a knowing. But if you enter into your own investigation, examining all of the aspects of your own being, finding out who is doing the investigating, if you're willing to live by the principle, not my will, but higher will be done, if you're willing to travel beyond all knowing, then you may realize what I've attempted to point towards. Only then will you taste for yourself the profound mystery and beauty of simply existing. There is another possibility for life. There is something sacred, unfathomable, that can be discovered in the still depths of your being, beyond concepts, beyond dogmas, beyond conditioned activity and all preferences. It is not acquired by techniques, rituals, or practices. There is no how to get it. There's no system. There's no way to the way. As they say in Zen, it is discovering your original face before you were born. It is not about adding more to yourself. It is becoming a light unto oneself, a light that dispels the illusion of the self. Life will always remain unfulfilled, and the heart will always remain restless, until it comes to rest in that mystery beyond name and form.
Shri